There we go.
Welcome back to Senate Education, Wednesday, May 12th, 1:51 p.m. We are now turning our attention to S13, an act relating to implementation of the pupil weighting factors report. I believe it's on notice, or maybe it's even was up on the House floor today. We're going to start with Representative Ansel. Great to see you, Janet. Great to see you, Representative. You're muted. There you go. And a couple of things. We're hoping if you would just, you saw, of course, our original work. You also, I know House Education made a few changes. Wondering if you might share with us what ways and means your thinking was. This is our first look back into this issue, and we have Ledge Counsel and JFO with us. So any background and any steps you all took would be really helpful. The other thing, while you are here, if you wouldn't mind, we are getting some concern from colleagues about the yield bill, in that there's something in there for small schools, which I think we are going to have to address down the hall here. So I don't know if you are prepped and ready to say something about that. You're not, but we can always have you back. So why don't we just stick with S13 for now, and then we can have you back perhaps tomorrow when we get the yield bill back. Okay, so with that, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. For the record, Janet Ansel. And by the time I finish talking, I might have the small schools thing in my head. So I didn't when I walked in. Thank you for having me in. And just so that I understand, the committee hasn't had a walkthrough of either the House Ed changes or the House Ways and Means changes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so I'm just going to give you a very sort of overview of where we are. And the bill is currently on the calendar. It's going to go to the House Appropriations Committee today. And I don't know how long they'll take with it, but there is an appropriation in it. So, you know, when S13 left the Senate, it's obviously of interest to our committee, and I read the bill. I thought this is great, really good approach to a really tough problem. And so, you know, was really pleased to see the work that the Senate had done on the issue. It went first to House Education, and they made changes, particularly in what I would call the sort of the meat of the bill, which is the powers and duties, the work that the task force is being asked to do. And so they focused their attention mostly on that section. We had a number of joint meetings with them, and sometimes we had full two committees together. Sometimes one or two members of my committee would sit in their committee, or one or two of their committee members would sit in our committee. So we did a lot of collaborating and overlap, and heard a lot of the same witnesses that they did. I suspect probably at the end of the day, we heard all the same witnesses, although sometimes we heard them together and sometimes separately. When it came to our committee, the area that we focused on that House Education hadn't looked at was the composition of the task force and sort of how it gets staffed and how it gets structured. And so the initial changes that we made were in the composition of the task force. We liked what your committee had said, which is that this is a legislative task force. We thought that's what it ought to be. And so in that spirit, we removed the two administration people from the task force. We thought it should be entirely legislative. And that left just 4 people, which we thought was too few. So we did 2 members from the 2 education committees, 2 members from Ways and Means, and 2 members from the Finance Committee. And we felt that it made sense, consistent with the work you did, that we should identify the committees that were going to be involved in this, that those are the committees that really have this kind of overlapping jurisdiction on these issues. Because we had 2 people, we didn't do the chair or designee. We had the appointing authority do it. We did the committee on committees on your side. Not sure if that's what you would have wanted, but that's what I sort of used to doing, and the speaker on our side. We also included something similar to what happens in a number of these joint committees, where not all members would be from the same political party. So we added that in. What that meant is that we needed to find an appropriate staff support and an appropriate role for the Agency of Education and for the state board chair. And so we said that the chair of the state board would be one of the listed entities that collaborate with the task force. We felt that was the right role for that person. And for the Agency of Education, we treated them. We have technical assistance being provided by the Joint Fiscal Office, by the Agency of Education, and by the Department of Taxes. And I never was quite sure if technical assistance was the right word, but what we really envision is Brad James specifically, because he's such a good resource for us, that he would be working with the committee and working with Joint Fiscal as he typically does. And that's what we wanted to see happen. And he felt that language was sufficient to loop him in that role. The part we added the Department of Taxes because they have access to some of the data that the task force might need. We're not sure that they will, but they work so closely with Joint Fiscal and with AOE on some of these things. We also changed sort of the administrative support. So it's not the Secretary of Education that convenes the first meeting. It will be the Joint Fiscal Office. That's what we do with Joint Fiscal Committee. Seems to work. They just pull everybody together. Then they elect a chair. And in this case, we suggested co-chairs, a chair from the Senate and a chair from the House. That I've worked with committees that do that, and it seems to work fairly well. Trying to remember what else we did on the so the administrative support would be coming from the Joint Fiscal Office, not from the Agency of Education. So we're making this a pure legislative committee. Hopefully Jim can tell me if I've forgotten something, but I think that is it on the I don't have my notes in front of me, and I don't have the side by side, but I think that's it, or not. He's leading forward. Not sure. He's muted, I think.
Sorry. I think the other few things were that you took out the limit on the number of meetings at 12. So they can meet more than 12 times. They get paid for 12, but they can meet for more. And you changed some dates. You moved up the work date a bit. And the reporting date as well. So you changed some dates.
Thank you. We had the first meeting by June 1st and the report by December 15th, really wanting enough lead time for the legislature to take action. And you're right, the reminder on the public, we said 2 public meetings, and we also wrote something in saying that for every meeting the task force does, they should have some time for public comment, whether they do it at the beginning or at the end. That noticed particularly select boards do that. And I think it's a great tool so that so there's an outlet at every meeting for people to be able to make comment. And we only allowed pay for 12 meetings, but we eliminated the restriction that you can't meet more than 12 times. We thought they could meet as often as they wanted, but the pay would be limited to the 12. I think that is it.
Center Alliance.
So I'm looking at the side by side, and I see that you have a section on a simulator for the Agency of Ed in conjunction with Joint Fiscal to develop or create a user-friendly weighting factors simulator. And is that? It sounds great. This is exactly what we need. Sounds user-friendly and everything else, but
I don't know what it is.
I do know I can figure out what it is. I'm just trying to sort out whether or not it can happen in the time frame.
Yeah. So that got added by House Ed, not by us.
Okay.
I mean, I kept thinking of a simulator as being sort of like a flight simulator or something.
Right.
I had something in the mall that you could get into. So that was their concept, not ours. We redid it a little bit because what we wanted to be sure about is that it really belonged to the task force. We felt that we needed to have somebody sort of manage it, and just concern about how it gets, who has access to it, who can run what through it, so. But I think House Education can give you better information on
Okay.
how it's really intended to work.
Yeah, I can just see some school board meetings coming up with 20 different simulations before us.
Well, that was frankly what we were worried about a little
Yeah,
bit.
that's what I would.
Yeah, and we didn't want the task, we want the task force to be able to actually do its work, and we didn't want it to be overwhelmed by, I had visions of thousands of these different spreadsheets coming in, and I'm not sure that would actually happen, but it just, and Brad James did testify to us about the simulator and to House Ed, I think, as well. He wanted to be sure that because it's easier for him to set it up than to have somebody else set it up and have to fix it. And so I think in some ways, the reason it's in the bill at all is to accommodate that and make sure that he's the one who sets it up. And we added that the task force would manage it.
Thank you.
So do you mind if you excuse me for a second while I see if I can, my iPad's charged enough that I can get the side-by-side in front of me?
Sure, absolutely.
So the side-by-side that you have, Mr. Lyons, it's the House Education and Ways and Means changes, not just Ways and Means, because they worked off the House changes. So just so you know, not all of this came from Ways and Means.
Okay.
Right. So the meat of the bill, the powers and duties, we did make some changes to what House Education did. And I think they're probably better to explain what they did. But we agreed with what they did. And then we made, I think we have changed the language a bit in one of them, and then we added a couple. And so do people all have the side by side?
Yes.
Well, they have a different one though. Sorry, Representative. So they've got just a version comparing what you did, which includes the House Education's work compared to what they did. You've got 3 columns, you've got 2 columns. Because I didn't think they wanted to see necessarily which committee did what the overall result was.
And
So,
I'm looking on the side by side in House Education because I don't have it myself. So
You want to look at the one in Senate Education for today? Is that helpful to you, or do you want to just speak more broadly and we can jump into the weeds with Jim?
I just want to I want to be sure I don't forget something. That's all. Okay. So I'm just going to pull up the one that includes our amendment just so that I don't forget things. So I've gone through the composition of the task force, and there's 2 pieces that we changed. This is a section that was in the Senate bill, which is considering the impact of the recommended weights or categorical aid on the goals and outcomes of Act 16, Act 46. We just changed the language so it talked, rather than impacts, it talks about the interaction between the weights and those acts, because our feeling is that the impacts go both directions. That was just a tweak in the language. But the 2 that we added were for the task force to recommend ways to mitigate the impacts on residential property tax rates and consider tax rate equity between districts. And that was sort of a understanding or a recognition that If everything else stays equal and we just plunk the weights in, that's all we do. We don't do anything else, which is not going to happen. There are going to be some intervening things. But if everything stayed equal and we put the weights in, it's residential taxpayers that will feel the impact, both up and down. It's not non-residential payers. It's not non-property tax revenue. It's only residential payers. So we wanted the task force to look at that and see whether there are ways, particularly when those residential rates are going to spike up, whether there are ways to mitigate that. So it's just trying to recognize the fact that that we have a system where the weights only impact residential payers. So that's fairly broad language. It could include I think House Education took out the language that the Senate had dealing with the Tax Commission report. That we didn't put that back in, but I think this language could accommodate that discussion if that's where the task force wanted to go. And then the other one we did, which is fairly significant, is to recommend whether to modify, retain, or repeal the excess spending threshold. And that's an important issue. And we included in the bill as well, I think I've covered everything else, to the last section of the bill, which is a moratorium on the excess spending penalty for 2 years. And that was added by Ways and Means.
Okay, great overview. Questions for Representative Ansel? All right, I think Senator Perschlick.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Hi, Representative Ansel. I had a comment. So I wasn't clear if you guys did this or education, and it was the wording on our side-by-side is page 3. But basically, we gave the task force or whatever we're calling it more leeway of like maybe if they thought doing categorical aid would be better than weighting factors, we kind of left that open and looking at the weights more broadly. But the language, the way I read it, that the House did is like you can't consider categorical aid instead of yields, and you have to use the exact weights that were in the report.
I don't. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just wonder if that was your understanding. No.
No, and I don't think we would have supported it if it had said that. My understanding is that although the language differed somewhat, that categorical aid was definitely one of the things the task force should look at. We also included, which I forgot, reference to age ranges on the weights. And I think so if you go to, I think it's number 8. And we had some word tweaking in here, I guess. The
Section 8?
I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. It's number 7, which we did not tweak, but the House Education did, which is the relationship between the recommended weights and categorical aids and the special ed funding. And then number 6, recommend how to transition to the recommended weights and categorical aid, including the availability and use of federal funding. So I think that all those references to categorical aid are intended to invite the task force to look at that.
Okay. And one other thing, if I can, Chair,
Please.
is on one of the things I remembered in our task force makeup was, if I remember correctly, somebody that would help the task force, or like an expert, basically thinking somebody like the authors of the report or something. Did you still have a role for those kind of education finance experts?
Yeah.
Want it to be a legislative committee, I agree with that.
So that came out, maybe Jim can help me with this, but House Education pulled back a bit on the consultant, certainly on the amount of money. And so that the role, I think they also wanted to be sure that that it wasn't a requirement that they retain the consultant. It was an option, and we agreed with that. We have had conversations with Dr. Colby, who authored the report. She's met with our committee on more than one occasion. Most recently, I think it was last week, which was very helpful. And I know she intends to be available, whether it's paid or not, but she certainly would be involved in the discussion. So they pulled back on the money, partly that had to do with the fact that joint fiscal is going to take on some of the, the report writing role, for example. Doesn't show in here, but I did talk with them, and they're willing to write the report. So that was another possible task for a consultant.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and my apologies if I missed things. I wasn't looking at this when I went through them. So if I've missed it, it wasn't because I meant to hide it. It's because I forgot it.
Well, we'll go through it with Jim, and if we do have any additional questions, we'll send you an email.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to come back. It's nice to see everybody.
Yeah, it's nice to see you as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Mr. Desmarais, how does it feel at this point then for you to walk us through the work that you presented in the side-by-side?
Of course. You have it on your screens?
I think we all have it either printed up or on our screens. Thank you.
Okay, so so on the left side of the side-by-side is what you've done, passed by the Senate. On the right side, it says House Ways and Means Amendment, but they were amending the House Education's work. So this is a combination of House Education and Ways and Means.
I think this is great, actually. Personally, I think that it keeps it a little cleaner for me at least. And then if any questions arise, we can certainly have the chair of House Ed in later, but this looks great.
Yep. So this is as it will be on the floor unless appropriations changes over on the House side. Okay, so findings on page 1, all the same on page 1. Page 2, you see a few small changes in subsection C. So they have taken out the words "as a corrective to the situation." And in the middle there, where it says, however, given they say statewide and unique nature of Vermont's education funding system. So that's a change. On the task force, A is the same. So creation is the same. B is membership, and that is different. So you had 6 members. They have 8 members. They've taken away the secretary and the chair of education and the state board. And they have doubled your membership of the committee members. So they have 8 members, all of whom are members of the General Assembly. And then they require in subdivision 2 on the right-hand side, the members are appointed from different parties on both the House and Senate side. Powers and duties, C is the same beginning part, and then you get into differences. So they have taken year 1 and 2 and replaced them with their version of 1 and 2. Both comes looking at the same types of things. So yours was recommend which weighting factors to modify or create and their associated weights, and whether any weights should be eliminated in lieu of categorical aid. And they've got consider how to integrate the weighting calculations from the report with Vermont's equalized pupil calculations, excess spending threshold, and yield calculations. And then year 2 was consider use of categorical aid, including whether that age should be used instead of some or all of the weighting factors. If weights are used, whether small school grants and other aid should be adjusted or terminated. They've got on their side, consider how categorical aid can address differences in the cost of educating students across school districts. So, but different language there. They have added new language in 3 and 4 on the right-hand side. So 3 says the purpose of calculating equalized pupils, recommend age ranges to be included in how to define a person from an economically deprived background, taking into account the current definition that's used, the Title 1 definition, and the definition for free and reduced price lunch. And then 4, in recognition that the current formula used to calculate equalized pupils uses more than one mathematical method, consider changes to the formula to simplify it and make its calculation more transparent. And that gets to the fact that the current formula has multipliers and addition, and trying to find a way to make it more simple. Your 3 and their 5 are on education quality standards, but your language is different. So yours is recommend how to ensure that school districts are using funding to meet education quality standards and improve student outcomes and opportunities. And their language is recommend statutory changes in the agency's powers and duties to ensure that all school districts are meeting education quality standards, improving student outcomes and opportunities. They have struck your 4, which is considering the Vermont Tax Structure Commission report. They made small modifications to your 5. So rather than saying new weights, they say recommended weights and categorical aid. They have struck your 6 and 7, which is around tuition rates for non-operating school districts and funding formulas in other states. They have modified your 8, basically to require that they consider the impact on federally required maintenance of effort and financial support requirements. They have modified your 9. You had considered the impact of the recommended weights. They have considered the interaction between the recommended weights and aid. On Act 60, they've added Act 68 and Act 46. They've added Act 68 in there as well. 9 and 10 on the right-hand side are new.
Senator Chin, did you have a question?
So Jim, going back to page 5 and picking up on one of Senator Perschlick's questions to Representative Ansell, I'm looking at item 6 at the top of page 5 in the House Ways and Means Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how important this is, but when it says recommend how to transition to the recommended weights and categorical aid, is it referring to the recommended weights in the report, or is it referring to the recommended weights that might come out of their task force efforts referred to in the previous clauses up above with the considering advice? Does that make sense of a question?
It does. I think it's the latter. So I think it's looking at their work, not the report. Yep.
Okay, Senator Perschlick.
Thank you. And I think, I'm not saying I disagree with it, but I think it's just good to point out that it's a big difference from our version, in that we said this task force can really look at the report and think about it, I think, a little more broadly, where the way I read the House language, it does constrict the task force to the weights in the report. And that's something to notice, I guess, whether something for us to think about how important that is to us, that the task force would be able to make changes to that, or think about some that we would implement and others that wouldn't. They seem to say, hey, we just like the report. We want what was in the report. Would you say that
yeah.
true, Jim?
What's your
I
take on that?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for the committee. It's
But
too
as you're
hard to-
reading the language, I mean, is it sounded as though Janet kind of disagreed with that, but maybe she wasn't even maybe she wasn't looking at that point exactly. Senator Perslick?
Well, I think the bottom of that page 3, those changes where we're, instead of recommending which weighting factors, it's consider how to integrate the weighting calculations from the report. So they will only
I see what you mean, yeah.
consider the weighting calculations from the report, where we said which weighting factors to modify or create. And, consider using categorical weight kind of instead of the weighting factors, but what they said is more, how categorical aid can be used for other things, not instead of changing the weights, which I think, from my understanding, is a concern of members for the House. They did not want to leave that possibility open that we would do categorical aid instead of waiting for one of the things that the report recommends weighting changes. And I think that last there was another one in here I thought kind of went along the same thing. I can't remember what it is, but I think that's just something I noticed. Oh, I guess, so Jim, here's my question. On number 7, on page 5, no, I guess it's number 8. At the bottom of page 5, we said, consider the impact of the recommended weights. Well, they said, consider the interaction between the recommended weights and categorical aid in the goals and outcomes of this. So I would say that's a very different charge. One is considering the impacts of the recommended weights or categorical aid, whatever because we gave the task force the ability to use categorical aid or weights. And so then they would consider the impacts of those, but their aid is, you're not considering the impact, you're just considering the interaction between the weights and categorical aid to meet the goals and the different acts, which is just, I think, is a substantial difference to consider.
Yeah. Senator Lyons?
If just remembering that piece, if up in number 1, under the powers and duties, you took out the word consider how to integrate weighting calculations from the report, that leaves it wide open as to whether it's a which or all or some. So just taking that word out might modify it sufficiently so that then when you get down to that interaction piece, it doesn't make as big and it doesn't have as big an effect. I like the flexibility that we have, is what I'm saying. I'm just trying to figure out how to address it so that it's not going back to old language.
Yeah, Senator Perslick.
Yeah, I agree with Senator Lyons on that. Taking out the it's one word, but it's a substantial change.
That's a substantial change.
But they do, to give even though I said that they changed our number 9, their number 8 we said consider the impact of the weights. They have recommended ways to mitigate the impacts on property tax, which I think is one of the things we were thinking about when we said consider the impact. So they did add that 9 specifically to mitigate the impacts between districts, which is something we didn't have so specific, which I think is good.
Senator Chinden.
I don't object to their item 10, right, where Senator Perchik was speaking to, but I would love some more education on the excess spending threshold and how that how it's come about and what the implications would be. But I think that will be a conversation for next January.
Right. But before, yeah, you're talking about section 5. Yeah. So let's just, for now, if we could just continue the walk through Jim, unless you want to respond to what Senator Perchlix and Senator Lyons were kind of going back and forth on.
Nope, not necessarily.
Okay, all right, why don't we continue the walkthrough and go from there?
Okay, so we're on the consultant, so subsection D.
Yeah,
So you have a shall, they have a may.
right.
That's a major difference there. You have qualifications for the consultant, they don't. Though they explain what the consultant would do, which is to model education violence scenarios and write the report, if retained. Collaboration, they've added the State Board of Education to the group of collaborators. Public meetings, they've added 2 as opposed to 1. And they've added language at the end, carrying over to the next page, saying that the task force shall include time during each of its meetings for public comment. They've moved up the report date from January 15 to December 15. They have had the JFO called the first meeting by June 1st, as opposed to the secretary by August 1st. They have co-chairs from each of the House and Senate. You've got a chair. They've struck the language about meeting not more than 12 times. In terms of assistance, they've got assistance coming from admin assistance from JFO rather than the agency. Technical, they've got assistance coming from the agency, Department of Taxes, and JFO. You had JFO. Legal is the same. And then compensation is the same. And then they have this section 3, which is the weighting factors simulator, which requires AOE working with JFO to create a user-friendly weighting factor simulator that will allow users to model the impact of proposed changes in weights on all school district tax rates. The creation and use by the task force of the simulator would be overseen by the task force. They have the same language about legislative action, but they've struck the last sentence. And they have this moratorium in section 5, 2-year moratorium on the excess spending penalty. And then they changed the appropriation for the consultant from 150,000 to 25,000. And they've changed the name of the act to an act relating to the people weighting factors report. That's it.
If we could return just, so section 5, Senator Chittenden, would you remind me what you mentioned?
So it has to do with the excess spending threshold.
Yeah, the moratorium.
That I don't recall discussing previously, and I just keep myself more, but this is not forceful language, so I guess I can support the exploration of that with knowing that I'll learn more between now and January.
Well,
Senator Perchlix.
Section 5 does create a moratorium for that spending moratorium, but it was up above on page 5 where it just says that the task force will consider whether it should be a more permanent or to extend the moratorium. But the bill would extend the excess spending penalties basically for 2 years.
Then I'd love to know more about that. I don't know.
Yeah. No, we will, and we're going to hear a little bit from Joint Fiscal next on the impacts on excess spending, what the moratorium would look like. We'll also take some additional testimony. This will, now that it has returned to us in this form, we're not the only committee that has jurisdiction over it anymore. This will be a finance issue as well, and they will. I'll hopefully connect with Chair Cummings later today, because timing, in a way, in legislative world, we have a lot of time, but it's time is actually tight if this also has to go to finance. I'm going to turn things over to Mr. Peralt and Ms. Parker at this point to pick up with the excess spending pieces and anything else that you think you should cover, Mark, if that works for you. I am due in appropriations right now, and hopefully we'll be back maybe within the next 10 minutes or so. Okay, so the floor is yours. And Senator Hooker, what do they say in Star Trek? You have the helm, or you have the whatever it is. It's yours.
Where does I have it? Okay.
Got the com.
Thank you. Be right back. And Jim, you're coming with me?
I am. Yep.
We'll zoom down together. All right, let's
Okay.
go.
Okay, so I'm
Star Trek.
at the fiscal office. I'm here with Brianna Parker, also from our office. There are only two sections of the bill that have a fiscal impact. One is Section 5, which is the excess spending moratorium you just started talking about. And then there's some appropriations that I need to touch on in Section 6. But the excess spending moratorium would just suspend the excess spending penalty for FY22 and FY23. The excess spending penalty provides that if a district goes over a threshold, which Brianna can help me, it's
$18,789 for FY22.
Okay, so if a district spends over that amount, we count that amount twice for the purposes of calculating their homestead property tax rate. So there's a penalty built in for exceeding that threshold. This bill would suspend that for the next 2 years. Now for FY22, districts have already set their spending. So it's not going to have any impact on their choices about where they actually set spending for this year. But there are 17 towns that would have tripped over it or are tripping over it in the absence of this bill. And the impact on the education fund in FY22 would be about $1.4 million. So that's money that would not come into the education fund as a result of the penalty that's in place under current law. Senator Chitton, you have a question?
Yeah, I'll ask a question if I may, Senator Hooker.
Yes, you may.
So I'm intrigued by this excess spending threshold, and what is the rationale for putting this moratorium in place? And I would like to, and I don't want to use the whole committee's time this afternoon, but understand where it came from originally, because I think there are other things that we could do on the overall grand list and ways to incent and motivate towns, or at least reward them for when they grow the grand list to contribute to the larger pie, and not just punish them when they overspend per pupil.
Right.
So I feel like this is a bit of a stick, and I'm interested in looking at some carrots when it comes to raising education funding from a macro level. But if you could tell me more about how this came about, why we're pushing for this moratorium for this coming year, I'm intrigued.
Sure. Well, it exists. It's been around for a long time, at least since 2015, because I looked up the law this morning to refresh my own memory. And the way it works is we looked at average per pupil spending back in 2015, and 121% of that amount is what the threshold was initially set at. So 121% of average spending in 2015. That becomes an anchor. And then every year since then, we allow it to grow by the rate of inflation. So at this point, it's up to a little over 18,000, or between 18 and 19,000. The reason it was put in place in the beginning was, I think, just to put a brake on high spenders, to try to slow down spending a little bit. But it hasn't been the case this year or in the past couple of years. But over the last 20 years, we've had years where spending has been growing at a pretty fast clip. So I think it was just an attempt to slow down spending somewhat. I think the reason for a moratorium at this point is that there's another section of the bill in which the committee is asking the task force to take a look at the excess spending penalty and see if it's something that we should retain in current law, or that we should suspend beyond, or basically repeal beyond FY23, which would happen under this bill. And starting in 2024, it would come back into effect. So,
Senator Perchlik.
Thank you. Mark, wasn't part of the reason also about, the Act 46 to equity, so that not just to try to control spending, but to, if you had one district that was spending a lot more, that money they would pay into the general education fund, so that they would help, so that there wasn't such a gap between some districts. Wasn't that part of the reason?
I mean, it may have been, but in practice, this has never been much of a revenue raiser for the education fund. I think in the current year we're in, or in FY21, it was like 900,000, which has been about the highest it's gotten. So in a $2 billion fund, it doesn't really move the needle very much in terms of tax rates or anything like that. But I think it was to get the attention of school boards. We know anecdotally that as school boards start to approach that threshold, in many cases, they make a significant effort to stay right below that threshold. So they kind of bump up against it. I think I mentioned, in FY22, I think there's only 17 school districts that would be affected by it out of 118. But if you look just below the threshold, you'll see that there's districts that are in the neighborhood that are paying attention to it. So I think it was intended as a way to get really high spending districts to think hard about their spending.
Okay. Senator Perchlik, are you finished?
I have a follow-up if I can.
Okay, go ahead.
And that is, do you know off the top of your head how those 17 districts that would have hit the cap line up with districts that would be either rural or in the economic, I can't remember what we call it, the economic challenge districts? Because I get the impression that it's being suggested because they're saying, hey, we've been hindered by this unequal weighting, so don't penalize us because we have to spend more because we have the more need. And so it's kind of a way of holding them harmless until the weights go in. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's part of the consideration, and that's why you're asking the task force to take a look at it. The task force that's looking at weighting, that's one of the issues that they would address. But in terms of the districts that are hitting it, Brianna, you did a little work, didn't you, on the type of districts that were in the 17? Because I was a little surprised that the 17 districts that actually hit the threshold. They aren't necessarily the districts that you'd think.
Yeah, definitely. I've got a list right here. I could read off a few names if that would be helpful to the committee. But districts such as Heartland, Hazen, West River, Twin Valley, Thetford, Bellows Falls are just a few of the districts that have gone over the threshold. Those districts went over the threshold on FY21. Those are also going over in FY22. So we can see that there are some trends there.
So they're not necessarily the high, wealthy districts, the wealthy or high wealth or high income districts that are bumping up against it. In some cases, it's small districts that just are really under the gun in terms of holding their spending down.
Okay. Senator Chittenden.
Very similar to Senator Perchlik's question. I'm not going to be a fly in the ointment here, but it's important for me. I'd love to see that list and how it compares to what was in that report regarding underfunded districts. Okay. I can support this moratorium if it's a middle ground to address what that report has highlighted as communities that don't have a fair or equitable weighting system during this study. But it doesn't, I don't hear that confidently in the responses I've heard so far. So I don't know how that works, but my concern is if this is only helping the communities that are already by the weighting measures overfunded, then I have severe pause in moving this forward. So it would be useful for me to overlay those communities that Brianna was just highlighting with what was in that report. And I can do that if you would share that information with me so that I can be fully supportive of this moratorium.
I think we can do that. And that's an interesting question. No one's asked that question before, but it's an interesting point. And I think we can line them up for you so you can see.
Okay. All right. Are you finished, Senator Chittenden?
I got more to talk about when it comes to weighting and all this stuff, but for today, I'll.
Well, any more questions then for Mr. Peralt or Ms. Parker?
So if I could just start, this also affects FY23, so I just wanted to touch on that before I finish. So in FY23, this will also be in effect. School boards don't go to their voters with FY23 budgets until next March. So there's no way for us to determine what it is, but it would be in the neighborhood. And then the only other thing I wanted to touch on is in section 6, because the House Ways and Means Committee doubled the size of the legislative membership from 4 to 8, the appropriation for the per diems and reimbursements needs to be increased from 10,800 up to 21,600. So it's a small matter, but it's something the House Ways and Means didn't want to deal with because the bill was going to appropriations after it left there. And the last thing I wanted to point out was the $25,000 appropriation for a consultant that's available if the task force wants to hire someone. That's a may, not a shall. So it's up to the task force if they want to hire somebody, and then it would be up to the joint fiscal office to go ahead and execute a contract and get somebody on board to do that work.
Okay.
And that's it.
Senator Lyons.
Just a quick question. It obviously, the bill gives you some work over the summer and fall, and I'm just wanting to know that it's not an overwhelming amount.
Yeah. Well, that's why we were encouraged the committee to include the Agency of Education and the Tax Department in this work. It was a little bit of a concern because Brianna is brand new and coming on and has some a learning curve for some of the modeling that she's going to be learning over the summer. So we think the way the bill is drafted right now, there are enough resources to draw from so that we will be able to meet the task force's needs. Starting really early though, June 1, a week after we leave. So it's going to be interesting.
Senator Chittenden.
So Mr. Peral and Brianna, I'd love to, and Ms. Park, may I call you Mark and Brianna? Is that?
Yes.
All right, never know the right titles. The one question I have for you that I'd love to buy you a cup of coffee over the next summer, and I want to bring back to this discussion in January, is I'm concerned that the funding formula in the great state of Vermont since the 90s with Act 60 does not incent or reward growth of our grand list. I live in a community where I serve on a city council and a school board where pre-Act 60, if you wanted a new high school, one thing you could do would be to zone and appropriately plan for a grand list growth that would generate a larger grand list to generate property revenues that would directly pay for that new school. And you could align the zoning and the land opening up to fit with those things so as to minimize the residual shock. That way the communities would experience that growth while also benefiting from the infrastructure upgrades that it would pay for without burdening the property taxpayers. With the new funding, how it all goes to the state, I don't see that incentive there anymore. So one concern I have is we're penalizing when communities overspend. I am seeing communities very hesitant and resistant to take on the negative consequences of expanding their grand list, the things that are so easy to cast concern with. That's why we're seeing sluggish, or relative to the rest of the nation, less growth in the great state of Vermont because of the Act 60 funding formula. I don't know if I'm making any sense with it.
So let me ask you, it sounds to me like what you're talking about is sort of a tax increment financing district for schools. Is that right?
I would like to reflect on pre-Act 60, if
Okay.
how you would say how it used to work and how it works now. I'm just concerned we're not incentivizing and rewarding communities for fostering the type of growth that spurs and pays for the economy, as well as the school infrastructure that, as I look at the landscape, we are going to need money for in the coming 10 to 20.
You know, one other thing that may have aggravated that phenomenon is that we used to have a school construction finance available, up to a quarter or more available from the general fund, not from the education fund. So property taxpayers weren't bearing the cost directly. We haven't had that now for about 10 years. So that's another issue. And we do have a facilities study in the H427. There's a $2.5 million set aside for a facilities analysis, so that when we come out of the pandemic and if a federal infrastructure bill becomes available, we're poised to make some of those investments. So, I mean, I think part of the answer for you is part of it maybe should be a responsibility that's not necessarily left to property taxpayers solely to pick up the cost of those kind of construction projects. And the other thing you're talking about, again, I haven't heard that idea suggested before, but it's an interesting one. We do it on the municipal side for, projects that we want to get built in, districts, and they get to use both education fund and municipal property tax money to do that.
Thanks for suffering with me with that poorly worded question. I'll try to better articulate it over the next few months.
Let us know what you find out, Senator Chittenden. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Senator Perchlik.
I don't know if this is a good question for JFO staff, but they had deleted our section where we talked about tuition rates for non-operating school districts and the tech centers. And I'm not really clear if there was, you probably don't know why they took it out, but is one of the reasons they took it out is because right now it doesn't really matter if your students are in a non-operating school, like you're just a sending town. The weighting factor would just be the same whether your students are being sent out or educated in your own district, or is there a difference that you see there?
I know that the Secretary of Education testified that it didn't make any sense to him, and he suggested taking it out. But Brianna, do you remember the rationale for dropping that section?
I don't beyond that testimony. I think it came out right after that.
But as far as your understanding of education funding, which is definitely greater than mine, do you see that there would be a difference whether you're a sending town or not, as far as?
I don't think so, because you pay tuition. So I'm not sure what the direct impact would be on changing the weights. No.
And I'm the same with technical centers because they're just getting students from the district.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, they get paid tuition based on the number of students that they send to the CTEs. And I know that that's based on a rolling average over a number of years. I believe it's 3 years. And so there's kind of like a equalization in that form, but I believe it's based on the number of full-time equivalent students there that the school districts are sending to CTEs.
So FTEs as opposed to equalized pupils.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So maybe there is a difference there because it's FTE.
Well, the weights wouldn't affect an FTE.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Right. Okay. So maybe that is something we want them to consider, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions or anything? Any other comments, Mr. Peralt or Ms. Parker? Just okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks for your time. So, committee, we're at the end of what was scheduled on the agenda, and our chair is not here, has been beamed over to to appropriations. Any comments, anything you want to talk about that we can then loop Senator Campion into? Senator Lyons.
No, I was just going to say, we're not ready to vote on this. So,
No, I think we need some more
I think we
discussion
need a
on
little
it.
more.
Yeah.
So I don't have any more questions, but as long as we've accomplished what the chair was thinking,
Okay. All right.
good.
We're good. Okay. I hate
Unless
to.
you want to communicate with him by,
I think, yeah, I
yeah.
think I will ask him what else he'd like to see us do or talk about. But talk amongst yourselves, whatever, whatever you do in Zoom world now.
Well, would you like to go offline and take a break?
That's a good idea, Jeannie. Yeah, you can take us offline for a few minutes. We'll take a 5-minute break and see what Senator Campion